Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are digging into that high-stakes Alaska summit between the US and Russia. It was a meeting that was supposed to end the war in Ukraine, but you know what? It looks like it might have actually pushed the two sides even further apart. Okay, so let's get right into the heart of this puzzle. Everybody had their hopes up, thinking this could be a real breakthrough, but the outcome? It was pretty much the exact opposite. So how on earth does a meeting designed for peace actually make the divide even wider? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack. Right, so let's set the scene. Heading into this summit, the optimism was, frankly, off the charts. But the reality is, the whole thing was built on a pretty shaky foundation from the start. You really can't overstate what a huge moment this was. For 3 hours, at a U.S. military base in Anchorage, of all places, these two leaders sat down face to face. It was the first time in more than 3.5 years. The entire world was holding its breath, just waiting for any sign that this could all be over. And then, after the meeting, President Trump came out and gave this statement. It's just a classic piece of diplomatic language, isn't it? He's highlighting the positive, but that second part of the quote, several major issues not yet fully agreed upon, that was the real story. It was a massive hint that behind those closed doors, the disagreements were as big and as fundamental as ever. So this is where it gets really interesting. You have to look past the photo ops, past the handshakes, and actually break down the specific words they used. Because a really subtle change in language, it turns out, revealed a gigantic gap between what the two sides wanted. Okay, look closely at this. The shift is subtle, but it is absolutely critical. Before this summit, the U.S. position was all about getting an immediate ceasefire. Just stop the fighting. But afterwards, the language changed to a lasting peace agreement. Now, that might not sound like a big deal, but it's not just about picking different words. It signals a major pivot, a move that actually brings the American position a lot closer to what Russia has been demanding all along. And that pivot suddenly makes a whole lot more sense when you hear Putin's core argument. He's been saying this for years, that any deal has to get rid of the fundamental causes of the war. But in Alaska, that phrase went from just being a Russian talking point to being the single biggest roadblock to getting any kind of deal done. So, what do they actually mean when they say fundamental causes? Well, it's not just about stopping the shooting. It's a list of demands that are, for them, completely non-negotiable. It means Ukraine has to give up any dream of joining NATO, and it has to accept really strict limits on its own military. We're talking about demands that go right to the very heart of Ukraine's ability to be an independent country. Now, to really understand where Russia is coming from with this, you kind of have to look at the history they point to as their justification. And it really all comes down to how the map of Europe has changed over the last 30 years or so. If you look at it from Moscow's perspective, this is a story of NATO constantly creeping closer. After the Soviet Union collapses, NATO starts expanding east, and it happens in these big waves. By 2004, the alliance doesn't just include old Warsaw Pact countries, it includes former Soviet republics right there on Russia's border. This steady advance is the basis for all the security complaints that Putin started making really loudly back in 2007. So, what's behind this point of view? Well, it's a mix of things. There's a deep historical fear of being invaded from the West. There's this strategic idea of needing a buffer zone of neutral countries. And there's this really strong belief that the West broke an unwritten promise not to expand NATO. But a lot of experts will tell you the real fear isn't actually military. It's political. It's the fear of having a successful, thriving democracy right on their doorstep. But look, this whole diplomatic standoff, it's not happening in some kind of bubble. It's playing out against this really fascinating and kind of weird economic backdrop, where Western sanctions are creating what you might call a paradox. On the one hand, there's no question the sanctions are biting. Things like the price cap on Russian oil have seriously hurt the tax money that's fueling the Kremlin's war. A 40% drop, that is a huge hit to your main source of income. But here's the other side of that paradox. While that's happening, the Russian economy as a whole hasn't collapsed. Not even close. In fact, in 2023, it actually grew by 3.6%. That's faster than a lot of the Western countries that put the sanctions on them in the first place. So what is going on here? Well, it looks like Russia managed to survive by pulling off this kind of three-step pivot. First, those crazy high energy prices in 2022 gave them a massive financial cushion. Then, as their old Western customers walked away, new ones, especially China and India, jumped in. And finally, Russia basically put its entire economy on a war footing. They cranked up defense spending, and now that spending is what's driving a lot of their economic growth. Okay, So let's put it all together. You've got these diplomatic positions that just don't move, and you combine that with a war economy that's proven to be surprisingly tough. And when you do that, the path forward starts to look, well, incredibly difficult. And this right here, this lays it all out in black and white. This is the core of the problem. On the biggest issues, territory, sovereignty, the military, the two sides aren't just disagreeing. They have completely opposite, mutually exclusive ideas for what the future should look like. There is just no overlap, no middle ground to be found right now. And this story is far from over. In just a few days, President Zelensky is flying to Washington to meet with President Trump. And you can bet that allies in Europe are watching this one very, very nervously. They're worried that the U.S. might try to pressure Ukraine into taking a deal based on this new peace agreement idea that came out of the Alaska summit.
Which leaves us with the big final question, right? The Alaska summit proved that the diplomatic path, for now, is completely blocked. And at the same time, the economies on all sides have kind of settled in for a long fight. So if talks aren't the answer, what is? What could possibly happen on the battlefield or somewhere else entirely that could actually trigger real, lasting change?